Wyoming Territory, summer of 1883. A 21-year-old mail-order bride steps off a stagecoach in Silver Creek to find her promised husband 3 weeks in the grave and the mayor of the town smiling at her like a wolf at a lamb. 3 nights later, she is dying alone in a thunderstorm on the side of the Bighorn Mountains. And then a pair of arms like oak branches lifts her out of the mud, and a voice she will never forget rumbles low above her, "I have her." When she wakes, she is staring at 3 men who share one face. 3 brothers who have not set foot in the valley below for 22 years. 3 brothers with a secret buried under the floorboards of their cabin that is about to burn a corrupt empire to the ground. This is the story of Coralie Ashmore and the Blackwood brothers of Bighorn, and it begins on a road heading west into country that gives nothing freely. The stagecoach rattled westward through country that grew harder with every mile. Coralie Ashmore pressed her gloved hand against the window frame to steady herself, watching Philadelphia fade into memory somewhere behind 1,000 miles of dust. She was 21 years old. She had $3 sewn into the lining of her traveling dress, a gold wedding ring that had belonged to her mother, and a worn leather Bible that had belonged to her father. Everything else she owned in the world fit inside a single carpet bag at her feet. The Reverend Thomas Ashmore had been buried 6 weeks ago. Consumption had taken him the way it took so many good men, slow and patient, eating him from the inside while he went on preaching Sundays until the last one. He had left his daughter nothing but the book and the ring and a single piece of advice written on the flyleaf in a hand that had grown shakier with each passing month. "Kindness is the last thing a poor man owns, Coralie. Never sell it." She had read those words so many times the ink felt warm to the touch. The letter had come through the Philadelphia Benevolent Society, the same society that had offered her a place scrubbing floors in a laundry house for $2 a week and a cot in a room with 11 other girls. The letter had promised something better. A Mr. Jedediah Crane of Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory. A man of standing with a modest ranch and a Christian disposition sought a wife of good character. Passage would be paid. A new life awaited. She had written back the same evening by candlelight. Now the coach slowed and the driver called out that they were coming into Silver Creek. Coralie smoothed her dress and touched the cameo at her throat and tried to remember how to breathe. The town rose from the prairie like something half built and half forgotten. A main street of warped boards and sun-bleached signs, a saloon, a livery, a bank with fresh paint that looked out of place among the rest. And at the far end, tall again, the shoulder of the Bighorn Mountains, a 2-story building with the words Silver Creek Municipal Hall carved above the door. The coach stopped. The driver helped her down and set her carpet bag on the boardwalk and tipped his hat without meeting her eyes. He climbed back up and snapped the reins and was gone before she could ask him anything. She stood alone in the street. A woman across the way paused with a basket on her hip and looked at Coralie with something that might have been pity. Then the woman turned her face away and walked on. A voice behind her said, "You must be Miss Ashmore." She turned. The man who had spoken was tall and heavy through the chest, dressed in a black frock coat that fitted him like a second skin. His hair was oiled back from a high forehead, and his mustache was trimmed to a thin, careful line above a smile that did not reach his eyes. He wore a silver watch chain across his vest and a ring on his small finger that caught the afternoon sun. "My name is Horatio Thorne," he said. "I am the mayor of Silver Creek, and I am afraid I am the bearer of unwelcome news." Coralie felt something cold move through her chest. "Mr. Crane," she said. Thorne nodded slowly and arranged his face into the proper shape for sorrow. "Mr. Crane passed 3 weeks ago, a sudden affliction. It grieves me that the news could not reach you in time." He let the silence sit. "But do not despair, Miss Ashmore. I have taken the liberty of arranging a temporary situation for you. My establishment, the Silver Rose Hotel, has need of a young woman of refinement, room and board, honest wages, a place to gather yourself while you consider your future." He offered his arm. She did not take it. Instead, she bent and picked up her own carpet bag and said, Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Thorne. I would be grateful for a room. He watched her lift the bag. Something flickered behind his eyes and was gone. As you wish, he said. The Silver Rose Hotel sat above the saloon. The stairs smelled of cigar smoke and spilled whiskey and something older underneath. The room Thorne gave her was at the end of a narrow hall with a single window looking out over an alley where a pair of mangy dogs were fighting over a bone. The bed sagged. The wash basin had a crack running through it. There was a lock on the door, but the screws that held the plate were loose in the wood, and Coralie saw at once that a strong hand could push that door open without much trouble at all. She sat on the edge of the sagging bed. She did not cry. Her father had been buried 6 weeks ago, and the tears had not come then, and they would not come now either. Instead, she opened her carpet bag, and she took out her Bible, and she turned to the psalm her father had marked with a blue ribbon. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. She read the words until the light through the window turned orange and then red and then blue. At some hour after dark, she heard voices in the hallway. She moved to the door without letting her boots strike the floor. She pressed her ear to the wood. 2 men. One was Thorne. The other had a voice like gravel in a tin pan. Philadelphia girl, Thorne was saying, too proud for her own good. They are always the most interesting to break. The other man laughed low. How long you want her to soften? 3 days, 4 at the most. After that, she will understand her situation, and the understanding will make her reasonable. See that the night clerk knows to leave the hall lamps low. A woman thinks twice about running in the dark. And if she tries anyway, then you make sure she does not get far. The bighorns are no place for a lady in a traveling dress. If the cold does not take her, the wolves will, and Silver Creek will wring its hands and bury an empty coffin, and that will be the end of Miss Coralie Ashmore. The footsteps moved away down the hall. Coralie stood in the dark with her back against the door. Her heart was a fist inside her chest. She thought of her father. She thought of the flyleaf. Kindness is the last thing a poor man owns, and she thought not for the first time in her life that there was a kind of courage that had nothing to do with not being afraid. She waited 1 full hour by the pocket watch at her belt. Then she tied her boots around her neck by their laces and lifted the window and climbed out onto the sloping roof above the alley. The dogs were gone. The moon was a thin white slice of bone above the bighorns. She lowered herself to the water barrel beside the wall, and from there to the dirt, and she put on her boots, and she walked out of Silver Creek with her carpet bag in one hand and her Bible in the other, and the town fell away behind her into silence. She walked until the town was a pale smear on the horizon. Then she walked some more. The road became a trail. The trail became a memory of a trail. By the time the sun came up, she was climbing into the foothills of the bighorns with her lungs burning and her dress torn at the hem, and she did not stop even then. She drank from a cold creek and ate nothing and walked until her legs would not carry her, and then she walked a little more on her knees and her hands. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the sky turned the color of old iron, and the wind came down off the peaks, smelling of rain. And Coralie Ashmore understood that she was going to die, on a mountain, in a country she did not know. And the thought that surprised her most was that she was not afraid. She was only tired. The storm struck before she could find shelter. Rain came in sheets that flattened the grass and turned the trail to running mud. Thunder cracked so close above her that she felt it in her teeth. She fell once and got up and fell again, and this time she could not get up, and she lay on her side with her cheek pressed to wet earth, and she watched lightning walk along the ridgeline above her, and she closed her eyes. Somewhere between the thunder and the silence that followed, she felt herself lifted. She could not open her eyes. She could only feel. A pair of arms under her knees and her shoulders, enormous arms, like oak branches. A chest broad as a door. The smell of leather and pine smoke and honest sweat. A voice above her that rumbled low in its own chest and said only, I have her. Another voice further off said, get her inside before the fever takes her. A third voice younger said, the good Lord sent her right to our door. Then darkness took her. When she woke, it was to firelight on a timber ceiling. She lay in a bed built for a much larger person under a quilt of sewn deer hide and wool in a room that smelled of cedar and wood smoke and something baking in a Dutch oven on the hearth. Her dress was gone. Someone had put her in a clean cotton shirt that came down to her knees and was so large across the shoulders that it slipped when she moved. Her hair had been loosened from its pins, and someone had combed it with what must have been enormous care. She turned her head and she saw them. Three men stood at the foot of the bed. They were dressed in dark wool and leather, and they held their hats in their hands, and Corley Ashmore understood in a single suspended heartbeat that she was looking at three faces that were the same face. Three men born of 1 hour. Tall, each of them, taller than any man she had ever seen in Philadelphia, with shoulders that filled the doorway behind them, and hands large enough to span a wagon wheel. Dark hair streaked with early silver at the temples. Weathered skin, eyes the color of honey held up to a lamp. 42 years old by the lines around those eyes, lines earned and not given. Three brothers, three mirrors of the same grave and handsome face. The one in the center spoke first. His voice was the one she had heard in the storm. The rumble, "You are safe, miss. No one here will harm you. My name is Thaddeus Blackwood. These are my brothers. This one on my right is Obadiah. The one on my left is Silas. You are in our home. You have been sleeping for near 2 days." She tried to speak and found her throat too dry. The brother on the left, Silas, stepped forward at once with a tin cup of water. He did not touch her. He set the cup on a small table beside the bed and stepped back again. His movements were careful the way a man is careful around a wounded deer. She drank. The water was cold and tasted of stone. "Thank you," she managed. Thaddeus Blackwood nodded once. "My brothers and I would like to know your name and how you came to be on this mountain in a storm with no coat and no horse. But we will wait until you are strong enough." "Corley Ashmore," she said. "My name is Corley Ashmore. I was coming west to be married. The man I was to marry is dead. The mayor of Silver Creek meant to do me harm. So I ran." The three brothers looked at one another. Something passed between them that had no need of words, a current that had been running between the three of them for 42 years. The one called Obadiah, the middle brother, turned his face slightly away. The one called Silas let out a breath he had been holding. Thaddeus said, "Mayor Thorne." Yes, a silence settled over the cabin that Corley did not yet understand. "You rest," Thaddeus said. "We will speak again in the morning. There is soup on the hearth when you can hold a spoon. The door is not locked. No man here will come through it unless you call." They put their hats back on and they walked out of the cabin, and she listened to 3 sets of boot steps move across the porch and down into the yard, and she lay back against the pillow, and she closed her eyes and slept the first real sleep she had slept in weeks. She woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee. An old man sat in a chair by the hearth with a Bible open on his knees. He was 70 if he was a day lean and weathered to a color like old saddle leather, with a white beard that reached the second button of his flannel shirt. His eyes, when he lifted them from the page, were the clearest pale blue she had ever seen, and they looked at her the way her father had once looked at her. Without hurry, without judgment, with a kind of patient attention that belonged to another age of the world. "Good morning, child," he said. "My name is Ezekiel Pembroke. The boys call me Zeke. I have been the closest thing those three brothers have had to a father for 22 years, and I am the only man on this mountain who knows how to make coffee that will not peel the paint off a barn. Will you take a cup with me?" She sat up slowly. "I would be grateful." He rose and poured from an enameled pot and brought her a tin cup with both hands. He sat back down and he watched her drink, and he said, "Miss Ashmore." "Is that right?" "Yes, sir." He nodded toward the carpet bag, which had been set neatly beside the bed. "Thaddeus brought your things in." Nobody opened the bag, but I will tell you, child, that a Bible sticks out the top of a bag the way a candle sticks out of a lantern. And I could not help but see the name written on the inside cover in a hand I have not seen in 21 years. She went still. "Thomas Ashmore," the old man said softly. "Reverend Thomas Ashmore of the 2nd Pennsylvania Field Hospital." He prayed over me when a mini ball took me through the shoulder at Antietam. He wrote letters home for men who could not write, and he held the hands of men who were dying, and he did it all with a kind of quiet that I have never forgotten. I did not know he had a daughter. Coralie set the cup down because her hand had begun to shake. He was my father, she said. He died 6 weeks ago. Ezekiel Pembroke closed his Bible and looked into the fire for a long moment, and when he looked back at her, his pale eyes were wet. Child, he said, child, the Lord does not move in straight lines. He moves in circles that take a lifetime to close. Your father saved my life on a battlefield 21 years ago. And the boys who pulled you out of that storm yesterday are the sons of the best man I ever knew after him. You have not stumbled into this cabin by accident. You have come home to a door you did not know was yours. She did not trust herself to speak. She only nodded, and the tears she had not shed for her father finally came, and old Zeke Pembroke sat across the hearth and let her weep without trying to stop her, which was the greatest kindness anyone had shown her in 6 weeks. That evening, the three brothers came back inside. They had been working since dawn. Thaddeus had mended a stretch of the pole corral that had shifted in the thaw. Obadiah had been in the forge behind the cabin, and Coralie saw as he came through the door that his shirt was dark with the clean sweat of a man who worked in heat all day. Silas had been up on the ridge with a rifle and came back with a brace of grouse hanging from his belt. They washed at the basin on the porch, and they came in quietly, and they took their places at the table without a word. And Zeke said grace, and the grace was the same grace Coralie had heard her father say 1,000 times over. 1,000 suppers, and she lowered her head, and she thought, I have come home to a door I did not know was mine. They ate. Coralie watched them while she pretended not to. Thaddeus was the one who spoke for the three of them when speech was required. He ate slowly, and he listened more than he ate, and his eyes moved around the table, keeping account of everyone the way a man keeps account who has been in charge of other lives for a long time. When he looked at Coralie, his face did not change, but his eyes held on her half a second longer than they needed to, and then moved on. Obadiah did not speak at all that first supper, but at the end of the meal he rose and crossed to a small shelf near the hearth, and he took down a wooden box, and he brought it to her, and he set it on the table beside her plate. He did not meet her eyes. Inside the box on a square of blue felt was a comb carved from pale cedar wood. The teeth were fine and even. Along the top rail, someone had carved a line of prairie flowers so small and so delicate that Coralie could not imagine how a man with hands that size had done it. She looked up. Obadiah Blackwood was already walking away to take his dishes to the wash basin, his back turned so she could not see his face. Thank you, she said to his back. He paused. He nodded once without turning. Then he went on. Silas was the one who made her laugh that night. He was telling a story about a mule his brothers had bought him for his 13th birthday, a mule so stubborn it had once stood in a creek for 2 hours refusing to move, while all three boys tried to push and pull and bribe it with apples. The story was not the thing. The telling of it was. Silas had a way of leaning forwards on his elbows and letting his eyes go wide at the moments that mattered. And he caught Coralie glancing at him, and he broke into a grin that cut 20 years off his face, and for one moment all she could see was a boy. She laughed. She had not laughed since Philadelphia. She pressed a hand to her mouth as if the sound had startled her as much as it startled the brothers. Thaddeus looked up sharply, and then his hard face softened by some small fraction that she almost missed, and Obadiah at the wash basin stopped scrubbing the plate in his hand, and Silas looked straight at her with a kind of wonder, as if he had only just that moment remembered what laughter sounded like in that cabin. Zeke Pembroke said quietly into his coffee, well now, well now. That night, lying in the bed that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, Coralie Ashmore listened to the sounds of three large men moving around a cabin they had built with their own hands, and for the first time since her father had taken his last breath, she was not afraid of the dark. 4 days passed. She learned the shape of the cabin and the shape of the men inside it. Thaddeus read by the fire every evening, and when she looked over his shoulder, once she saw it was a battered copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, with whole pages underlined in pencil. Obadiah worked in the forge from first light and came back each evening with a new thing in his pocket for her: a hairpin, a sewing needle of fine steel, a small cross on a cord of braided leather. He never presented these gifts directly. He left them on the table beside her place at supper, the way a cat leaves offerings on a porch. Silas took her out on the fourth morning and taught her to read the prints of deer and rabbit and fox in the soft earth beside the creek. And he laughed at her when she mistook a coyote for a tone, and she laughed back at him. And the laughing was easier each time. On the fourth afternoon, she walked down to the creek alone to wash her face, and there she saw Obadiah Blackwood with his shirt set aside on a rock, washing in the cold water. His back was a map of old pain. Long, pale lines crossed it from shoulder to waist. A dozen of them. 2 dozen. Scars laid down in rows that did not belong on any man but a slave, or a prisoner, or a son of Job. She sucked in a breath before she could stop herself. He heard her. He went very still. Then, without turning, without looking at her, he reached for his shirt, and he pulled it over his shoulders, and he walked past her up the bank, and he was gone into the pines without a word. That night, she asked Zeke, and Zeke looked into the fire for a long time before he answered. When the boys were 20 years old, he said, Horatio Thorne was a young man with ambition and a patient kind of cruelty. The Blackwood Ranch was the largest holding in the valley below this mountain. Zebediah Blackwood, the father of those 3 men out there, was a good man and a stubborn one, and he refused to sell to Thorne no matter the offer. So Thorne arranged a thing. He had stock moved onto Blackwood land in the night, and he had a witness paid to swear Zebediah had stolen it. The court was not clean. The rope was not clean. The morning they hanged Zebediah Blackwood for a crime he did not commit, his 3 sons stood at the foot of the gallows and they watched. Their mother, Winifred, did not last 6 months after. Grief took her the way grief takes a woman who has loved one man her whole life. Corley closed her eyes. After Zeke went on, after the house was taken and the land was taken, and there was nothing left, Thorne had his men come for Obadiah. He was the sensitive one even then. Thorne believed there was a hidden cache of gold somewhere on the old place, and he believed he could whip the location out of the boy. He was wrong. There was no gold. But Obadiah did not know there was no gold. He only knew what his father had told him, which was that Blackwood men do not beg and do not break. He did not break. Thaddeus and Silas got him out on the 3rd night. That was the night the 3 of them climbed onto this mountain. They made their vow at their father's grave before they climbed. They said they would not set foot in the valley again until they could do so with the truth of his innocence in their hands. And they have not set foot in that valley for 22 years. And you, Corley said softly. Zeke smiled a tired smile. I live in a little cabin north of the town. The people in Silver Creek know me as Old Zeke the Sheep Man. I sell them wool and cheese, and they think I am a lonely old fool. None of them have ever connected the Sheep Man to the Blackwood name. I carry messages to the boys. I carry news. And I carry something else besides. He reached inside his flannel shirt and brought out a key on a leather cord. Zebediah Blackwood gave me this the night before he died, Zeke said. He gave me this, and he gave me something else that I have been keeping all these long years for a purpose I did not know until today. I believe the Lord has been keeping it for you as much as for the boys. But we will speak of that tomorrow. Tonight you sleep. On the 5th day, Silas rode out at dawn and came back at midday with his face set like a stone. He swung down from the saddle, and he walked straight to Thaddeus in the yard, and he said, 3 riders, Thorne men. They are at the foot of the pass, and they are asking questions of a woman who sells eggs at the trailhead. She told them nothing, but they did not believe her. They will be on the mountain by morning. Thaddeus stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and walked past Silas toward the cabin, and he stopped on the porch where Corley had come out to hear. He looked at her for a long time. Miss Ashmore, he said at last, my brothers and I made a vow at our father's grave when we were 20 years old. For 22 years we have kept that vow. We have not gone down off this mountain, and we have not raised a hand in the affairs of the valley below. We have mourned our father, and we have lived quiet lives, and we have waited." He paused. He looked past her at the mountains. "Our mother used to tell us that a vow is a promise made to the person you were when you made it. But a man is not only the person he was, a man is also the person he is. And the person I am today cannot watch three riders come up this mountain in the morning to drag you back to that town." Obadiah had come up behind his brother without a sound. Silas came up on the other side. They stood three across on the porch like a wall, and old Zeke Pembroke came out of the cabin behind Coralie and stood at her shoulder. "We fight," Thaddeus Blackwood said. Obadiah nodded once. Silas said softly, "It is time, brother. It has been time for a long while." Zeke Pembroke placed his weathered hand on Coralie's shoulder and squeezed it gently. She felt the weight of it like a benediction. She looked up at Thaddeus, at the hard, honey-colored eyes that had gone soft around the edges when they rested on her, and she understood that she was watching three men break a vow they had carried for half their lives, and she understood that they were breaking it for her, and she understood that she did not know how to thank them, and that she did not need to because the debt went deeper than thanks. She said only, "My father would have called you good men." Thaddeus Blackwood took off his hat and held it over his heart. "Then your father," he said, "would have called us what we mean to be." The wind came down off the Bighorn Peaks that evening, and it moved through the pines with a sound like a long, slow breath, and in the cabin behind the four of them, Zeke Pembroke knelt at the hearth and lifted a loose board with the tip of his knife. And from the hollow beneath it, he drew out a tin box that had been waiting there for 22 years. The tin box sat on the table between them in the lamplight. Zeke Pembroke laid his hand flat on the dented lid, the way a man lays a hand on a coffin, and when he lifted that hand away, his fingers trembled just a little. 22 years, he said, and in all that time I have opened this box exactly 3 times. Once the night Zebediah Blackwood gave it to me. Once the night after they put him in the ground. And once on a Sunday morning in 1875 when I thought the weight of knowing what was inside of it might be the thing that finally killed me. I am opening it tonight because the Lord has sent us the reason he kept it hidden." The three brothers stood at the far end of the table. Thaddeus with his arms folded across his chest. Obadiah with his scarred hands resting flat on the wood. Silas with one boot up on the bench, leaning forward so that his face came into the circle of lamplight. Coralie sat on the bench nearest the hearth with her hands folded in her lap and the Bible on her knees, and she watched the old man open the box. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, brown with age, the corners bumped soft. Zeke lifted it out with both hands and set it in front of Thaddeus. "Your father kept books," he said, "the way some men keep diaries. He wrote down every deal, every handshake, every suspicious sale of cattle in this valley from 1861 until the week he died. And in the last year of his life, he started writing down other things. Names of witnesses who had been paid, judges who had signed papers they had no right to sign, deeds that had changed hands between Horatio Thorne and a dead woman who never existed. Your father suspected what was going to happen to him a full 4 months before it happened, and he put his suspicions into this book, and on the night before they took him, he rode out to my cabin and he gave it to me, and he said, 'Zeke, do not use this to avenge me. Use it only when the day comes that an innocent person needs it to live.' He made me swear on the book." Zeke lifted his pale blue eyes to Coralie. "That day came when you walked into this cabin, child. I knew it the moment you told us your name." Thaddeus Blackwood opened the ledger. He turned pages slowly. His brothers leaned in. Silas drew in a sharp breath at a page near the middle. Obadiah touched a line of ink with one scarred finger, and his jaw tightened until the muscle jumped. Thaddeus read and kept reading, and the silence in that cabin had weight, had a living pressure like the air before a storm. When he closed the ledger at last, his face had aged 10 years in the space of 10 minutes. He knew, Thaddeus said. Our father knew they were coming for him. He wrote it down on a Tuesday in 1861, and they hanged him on a Friday morning 4 months later. And he did not run. He did not run. Zeke agreed because he believed that if he ran, The same thing would come for other men in this valley. He believed he could stand still and draw the lightning to one place. He was a proud man, and he was wrong about a few things, but he was not wrong about the kind of man Horatio Thorne was going to become. Silas Blackwood turned toward the wall and pressed the heel of his hand against his mouth. Obadiah reached out and laid his scarred fingers on his younger brother's shoulder and squeezed. Corley understood watching them that she was seeing something very few people had ever seen. She was seeing three men grieve a father 2 decades after they had buried him in a new way for a new reason. Their father had not been only a murdered man. Their father had been a man who saw his own murder coming and stood his ground anyway. The difference was everything. Zeke let them have their silence. After a long while, he said, "There is more in the ledger than you have seen. Your father wrote down 9 names in the last pages. 9 people in this valley. Thorne has taken land from in the last 6 years alone. Widows mostly, farmers whose wives died, old men whose sons went to the railroads and never came back. 3 of those 9 names have little crosses beside them, and I know what those crosses mean because I have been to the graves." 3, Thaddeus said. 3, Zeke said. Martha Hollister in 79. Ephraim Doss in 81. And in May of this year, Adelia Crowhurst, who refused to sign her husband's land over to the bank on a Monday morning and was found at the bottom of her own well on a Tuesday night. The coroner called it a fall. The coroner works for Thorne. Coralie closed her eyes. She was not only a girl who had run from a wicked man in a hotel above a saloon. She was the 10th name on a list. She had been 10th in line for an unmarked grave. She opened her eyes and she looked at Thaddeus Blackwood, and the look she gave him was not the look of a woman asking to be saved. It was the look of a woman asking to be counted. "I want to see that ledger," she said. "I want to read those names myself, every one of them." Thaddeus turned the book towards her without a word. The next 3 days inside that cabin were days Coralie Ashmore would remember for the rest of her life. She rose before first light each morning and she helped Zeke Pembroke lay out the day's work, and she did not ask permission. She kneaded bread in a wooden bowl that had been carved by Obadiah Blackwood before she was born. She mended a tear in Silas' riding coat with stitches so small and tight that Silas turned the coat over twice looking for the rip before he found it and then looked at her with a kind of wonder. She took a tin cup of black coffee out to Thaddeus, where he sat on the porch with his father's ledger open on his knee, and she set it beside him and she said, "You have been reading that book for 6 hours. Your eyes will fail you." And he looked up at her, and for the first time she saw the hard, honey-colored eyes crinkle at the corners with something that was almost a smile. "Sit with me," he said. She sat. He did not speak for a long while. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere down the slope, Obadiah's hammer rang against his anvil in the slow, patient rhythm of a man who was thinking while he worked. From the back of the cabin came the occasional crack of Silas' rifle as he checked the sight on a new load. Finally, Thaddeus said, "Miss Ashmore." "Coralie," she said. "Coralie." He said her name like a man setting down a glass he was afraid to break. "I was 20 years old when I made a vow at my father's grave. I am 42 now. I have been the person who made that vow for more than half my life. I had begun to believe that person was the only person I was ever going to be. A man with a promise to keep and nothing else." He looked down at the ledger. "And then you came through that door wet from a storm, and I realized there was a whole other man underneath the promised man. A man I had forgotten about. A man who used to want things." She did not breathe. "I am not asking you for anything," he said. "I want you to know that. You owe my brothers and me nothing but your own safety. I am telling you this because I am 42 years old and I do not have time to pretend I am not saying it. When this is over, whatever else happens, I wanted you to have heard it said out loud by somebody who meant it." He stood up. He left the coffee cup on the rail of the porch. He walked down the steps and out toward the corral, and he did not look back, and Coralie Ashmore sat very still with her hands folded in her lap, and she felt something in her chest that she had never felt before in her whole life, and she did not know what to call it yet and so she simply let it sit there and be. That afternoon, she went looking for Obadiah. She found him in the forge behind the cabin. The door was open. He was bent over the anvil with a horseshoe glowing cherry red on the face of the iron rod, and the muscles in his arms and his shoulders moved in the slow, clean rhythm of a man who had been doing this work for half his life. She stepped inside. He saw her, and he laid the horseshoe in a bucket of water, and the steam hissed up white. "You saw my back," he said. "At the creek, I did." He nodded as if that settled something. Then he reached into his shirt and he drew out a fine steel chain, and on the chain was a plain gold band, thin and worn smooth by years of being held. "I forged this ring when I was 20, he said. "I made it for a girl named Rebecca Haynes, whose father had said he would let us marry in the fall. Her father heard what the court said about my father 3 weeks later, and he took Rebecca east on the first stage. I never saw her again. I have worn this ring around my neck all these long years because I did not know what else to do with it. It did not feel right to melt it down, and it did not feel right to throw it away. A promise you made with your whole heart is a hard thing to put in the fire." He held the ring in his open, scarred palm between them. "I am not giving this to you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This ring belongs to a 20-year-old boy who no longer exists, and I will keep it for him out of respect. What I am showing you is that I know how to make one. When my hands make a thing, Miss Ashmore, they make it to last. That is all I wanted you to know." He closed his hand and slipped the chain back inside his shirt. Corley reached out without thinking and laid her hand on the back of his. His scarred knuckles were warm from the forge. He did not pull away. He looked down at her small white hand on the back of his enormous one, and she felt him draw in a slow breath as if breathing hurt. "Obadiah Blackwood," she said softly, "the boy you were is not gone. He is only quiet. A good woman would be lucky to hear him speak." She took her hand away, and she walked out of the forge, and she did not look back. That night, Silas taught her to shoot. He set a row of tin cans on a log at 20 paces, and he put a Colt revolver in her hand, and he stood behind her, and he set his big hands over hers to steady the weight. "You aim with both eyes open," he said closer to her ear. "You breathe out halfway, and you let the trigger surprise you. That is all there is to it. That in practice." She missed the first 3 cans. On the fourth shot, the leftmost can jumped off the wall and spun into the grass, and Corley let out a small sound of surprise, and Silas Blackwood let out a whoop that startled a crow out of a pine tree 100 yards away, and he lifted her clean off the ground in his 2 huge hands and spun her around once before he remembered himself and set her down again. He stepped back. His face went red under the tan. "I beg your pardon, Miss Ashmore. I forgot myself." She was laughing. She could not help it. "You forgot yourself beautifully, Silas Blackwood." He looked at the ground. He looked at his boots. He looked anywhere but at her. And then he looked at her, and Silas had the kind of smile that cut 20 years off his face, and there on the back slope of the Big Horn, in the last gold light of evening, Corley Ashmore saw a man and a boy living in the same body, and she thought that she had never seen anything so strange or so fine. Zeke Pembroke was watching from the porch. He shook his head slowly, and he said to no one at all, "3 stubborn fools and 1 young woman. The Lord does move in ways that humble a man." She lay awake that night in the cabin listening to the 3 brothers moving around in the other room, and she understood the shape of what was happening to her, and she understood that it was impossible. She loved Thaddeus. She loved the gravity of him, the weight of the promise he had kept, the softening around his eyes when he looked at her. She loved Obadiah. She loved the gentleness inside a man who had been broken and had built a life out of making beautiful things with his hands. She loved Silas. She loved the fact that the boy in him had not died, that somewhere under all the years a 20-year-old had kept laughing. She could not love 3 men. She could not choose one and shatter the brotherhood that was the only thing those 3 had built to survive. She could not stay, and she could not leave, and she lay with her eyes open and her Bible on her chest, and she prayed for guidance in words her father had taught her, and no answer came except the sound of the wind in the pines. In the morning, she went to Zeke. She sat down across from him at the hearth, and she said, "Tell me what to do." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Child, there is a mistake young people sometimes make about love. They think that love is a door with one room behind it, and you either walk in or you do not. But there are houses with many rooms, and a woman can live her whole life in such a house and love it all the days of her life without ever having to burn the other rooms down. I am not telling you to love three men. I am telling you that the Lord does not always ask us to choose between good things. Sometimes he asks us to become family to each other in whatever shape family takes, and trust that the shape is holy because the love in it is holy." She thought about that a long time. Then she said, "Zeke, I am going down the mountain." He went very still. "I am going to walk into Silver Creek tomorrow morning, and I am going to offer myself to Horatio Thorne in exchange for his word that he will leave the Blackwood brothers alone. If I stay here, those three good men break a vow they carried for 22 years because of me. If I give myself to Thorne, they do not have to break it. I am one life. They are three. The mathematics is simple." Zeke Pembroke closed his eyes. "Child," he said, "Horatio Thorne does not keep his word. You know that. I know it. But I also know that if I am in his hand, he will use me to draw the brothers down anyway. And when he draws them down, they will come down with the ledger and with you and with the truth. I am not running to save them. I am walking to give them the chance to finish what their father started." Zeke opened his eyes. They were wet again. "You are your father's daughter," he said. "God help us all, you are." She left before first light. She left a letter on the table weighted down with her mother's gold ring. She wrote three names at the top: Thaddeus, Obadiah, Silas. And beneath those names, she wrote, "I am not running from you. I am running toward the thing that must be done. Bring the ledger. Bring Zeke. Bring the truth of your father. I will be in Silver Creek waiting for you to finish what he began. The ring is not a goodbye. It is a promise that I will be there when you arrive." Coralie, she put on her mended traveling dress and her boots, and she took the trail down through the pines in the gray light before dawn. And she kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead because she knew that one glance behind her at the sleeping cabin would break her resolve entirely. Thorne had a man at every trailhead. She walked straight into the first one she came to, and she did not run when he leveled his rifle at her. She lifted her chin and she said, "I am Coralie Ashmore. I am the woman your master has been looking for. Take me to him." He took her. They rode into Silver Creek in the middle of the morning with her seated behind the rider and her wrists bound with a soft cord. The townspeople came out on their porches to watch. They watched silently. A woman across the street crossed herself. A child was pulled back inside a doorway by a mother who did not want the child to see. Horatio Thorne came out of the municipal hall, and he smiled his thin, careful smile, and he said, "Miss Ashmore, you have come home. I have come to talk," she said. "We will talk," he said, "in my office, at my leisure." He had her taken to a locked room at the back of the municipal hall. It was not a cell. It was a storeroom with a cot and a basin and a barred window that looked out on an alley. He did not hurt her. That was not his style. His style was patience and isolation in the slow application of fear. He left her there, and he locked the door from the outside, and she sat on the cot, and she watched the light move across the floor, and she waited. In the afternoon, a young woman brought her water and bread. The young woman was perhaps 16 years old, thin pale under a cap of mouse-brown hair, with the kind of watchful eyes that belong to people who have learned early that watching is how you survive. She set the tin plate down and she started to turn away, and Coralie said softly, "What is your name?" The girl froze. She glanced at the door. Then she whispered, "Prudence Merriweather. Folks call me Prue." Prue, Coralie said. "How long have you worked for Mr. Thorne?" "5 months," the girl said, "since my mother died. She did not mean to work for him. She owned a little piece of land south of town, and she did not want to sell. And then one morning she did not wake up. Mr. Thorne said she owed him money for the funeral and the headstone, and for something called a probate tax, and he said I had to work off the debt or go to the poorhouse. I did not know what else to do. Coralie looked at the girl for a long moment. Prue, she said, the debt is not real. Your mother did not owe him anything. He killed your mother, and he is using the lie of the debt to keep you where he can watch you. I am so sorry, child. I am so sorry. The girl began to cry without a sound. She pressed both her small hands over her mouth, and the tears rolled down her thin face, and she did not make any noise at all, which was the saddest crying Coralie had ever heard in her life, the crying of a child who had learned that crying out loud was dangerous. Coralie stood up, and she took Prudence Merriweather into her arm, and she held her. Listen to me, she whispered into the girl's hair. In a day or two, men are going to come into this town. 3 large men and an old man with a white beard. They are coming to end Horatio Thorne. When the fighting starts, he will move me to his office to use as his bargaining chip. He always keeps his prizes close. When that moment comes, you find me there with something sharp in your hand. Can you do that? I can take a paring knife from the kitchen tonight, Prue whispered. I can hide in the pantry across from his office before sunrise. When the fighting starts, he will forget about me. Everyone forgets about me. They will not forget about you again. Coralie said, I swear it on my father's book, not ever again. That night in the dark, Coralie heard footsteps in the corridor, and then the low voice of Horatio Thorne through the locked door. Miss Ashmore, he said pleasantly, I want you to understand something about your situation. I have sent a package up the mountain this afternoon. A small one. I sent your mother's gold ring, which I took the liberty of collecting from the cabin of a certain old sheepman north of town. Old Zeke was not home when my boys paid their visit, which was a disappointment, but the ring was in a little tin box on his mantle, and the ring will be enough. I included a short note. The note says, come down at dawn on the 15th of August with the ledger your father left behind, or the young woman will die one piece at a time, starting with the finger that wore this ring. I believe they will come. She put her hand over her mouth so he would not hear her breathing. So you see, Miss Ashmore, he went on, you have not saved your friends. You have only moved the battlefield to a place of my choosing. His footsteps moved away down the corridor. Coralie lowered herself to the cot in the dark, and she pressed her father's Bible against her chest, and she whispered into the hollow of the room the 23rd Psalm from beginning to end. Up on the mountain in the gray hour before dawn of the following morning, Thaddeus Blackwood stood on the porch of the cabin, holding a small parcel in his hands. Obadiah stood at his shoulder. Silas stood at his other shoulder. Zeke Pembroke, who had ridden all night to reach them after finding his own cabin ransacked, leaned on the porch rail with his white beard catching the first light. Inside the parcel was a gold ring and a folded piece of paper and a single human finger that was not Coralie Ashmore's finger. It belonged to the hand of Adelia Crowhurst, and Horatio Thorne had taken it from her body before they lowered her into a pauper grave. Thaddeus Blackwood read the note. He read it twice. Then he walked back into the cabin, and he knelt on the plank floor, and he lifted the loose board beside the hearth. From the hollow beneath, he drew out a canvas-wrapped bundle that had not been opened since the night before his father was hanged. He unwrapped it on the table. Inside was a gun belt and a holstered Colt and a long rifle with a worn stock, and carved into the walnut of that stock were the initials ZB. He set his father's rifle on the table. Obadiah came in behind him and went to the forge and returned with a broad axe he had made with his own hands. Silas came in and laid a lever-action rifle across the table beside the Colt. Zeke Pembroke came in last. Before riding up the mountain himself, Zeke had stopped at the homestead of a young man he trusted, Caleb Doss, whose father was one of the 9 names in the ledger. He had given the boy a sealed letter for Judge Fenwick Ainsworth in Laramie, and a packet of oilcloth containing a copy of the ledger made by candlelight in the hours after Thorne's men had ransacked his cabin. Caleb Doss had ridden out before midnight, on the fastest horse in his father's paddock. By dawn, he would be halfway to Laramie. By noon of the 15th, the judge would be in Silver Creek, or they would all die in the trying. Zeke unbuttoned his flannel shirt, and underneath it, on a worn leather gun belt he had not worn since 1865, rode an old Army revolver in a scarred holster. He had not drawn it in 19 years. He drew it now. He checked the cylinder. He slid it back into the leather. This time he said quietly, "I come down with you boys." Thaddeus Blackwood lifted his father's rifle off the table. "We ride at first light," he said, "all four of us. And we do not come back up this mountain until Horatio Thorne answers for every name in that ledger. Every single name." Outside the cabin, the first pale edge of morning was touching the peaks of the Bighorn, and somewhere below in the valley, a town that had forgotten the name Blackwood for a generation was about to remember it, and the wind that came down off the high country smelled of pine and of gunmetal, and of a promise at last about to be kept. They rode at first light, four horses moving down a mountain trail in single file. Thaddeus Blackwood in the lead on a tall bay gelding, his father's rifle across the saddlebow, and the ledger wrapped in oilcloth inside his saddlebag. Obadiah behind him on a gray, the broad axe at his hip, and a second rifle in a scabbard by his knee. Silas third, on a quick-footed roan, moving the way he had always moved in the woods, alert to every branch and every shift of wind. And Zeke Pembroke at the rear on a mule that had served him for 11 years, sitting his saddle straight as a man 30 years younger, with his old Army belt buckled over a clean white shirt, and his white beard combed, and his Bible in his coat pocket against his heart. They did not speak as the trail descended. There was nothing left to say. Every word between them had been said in the cabin in the hours before dawn, when Thaddeus had laid out the plan 3 times until each man knew every piece of it by heart, and every alternative to every piece, and every place where the plan could fail. The plan had 3 parts. The plan had one purpose. The purpose was Coralie Ashmore alive and Horatio Thorne answerable. The purpose was also something older than Coralie Ashmore. The purpose was a gallows in a dusty square in 1861, and a proud man who had not run when he could have run. The purpose was a mother who had died of a broken heart. The purpose was a boy named Obadiah, who had lasted 3 nights under a horsewhip without giving up a lie. The purpose was 2 decades of silence. Halfway down the mountain, where the trail widened onto a shelf of rock that overlooked the valley, Thaddeus reined in. He turned in the saddle, and he looked back at his brothers and at Zeke. The morning light was full on their faces now, and Coralie Ashmore, had she been there to see, it would have said that 4 men had never looked more ready to do a terrible and righteous thing. "If any of us does not come back," Thaddeus said, "the ledger goes forward in the hands of Caleb Doss to Judge Fenwick Ainsworth in Laramie." Zeke sent the boy out before midnight. "He will be in Silver Creek by noon today, with the judge and 15 federal marshals riding behind him. Our job is to keep Miss Ashmore alive until that hour. Nothing more and nothing less. We do not chase Thorne. We do not shoot him unless he forces our hand. We hold our ground. We hold the woman, and we let the law that our father believed in finish what Thorne started." Obadiah nodded once. Silas said, "For the old man." "For the old man," Thaddeus said. They rode on. They came down out of the foothills onto the flat country 2 hours after sunrise, and Silver Creek lay below them in a shallow dish of prairie, with the municipal hall rising pale at its far end. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No wagons moved in the streets. Thorne had ordered the town indoors. Doors were shut. Shutters were drawn. A hand-painted sign in front of the general store had been hastily turned to face the wall. Silver Creek was a town holding its breath. The 4 riders stopped at the edge of the street. Thaddeus lifted his hand and pointed without speaking. Silas swung down from the roan and handed the reins to Zeke. He took his lever-action rifle from the scabbard, and he crossed the street at a low run, and he slipped between the apothecary and the barber shop, and in a few moments Thaddeus saw him appear on the roof of the little whitewashed church at the far corner of the square, a figure low and motionless against the shingles, the rifle steady across his forearm. Silas had the whole of the main street in his sights and every window of the municipal hall besides. Thaddeus lifted his hand again. Obadiah swung down and handed his reins across and took the broad axe and moved along the backside of the buildings, keeping to the dry creek bed that ran behind the municipal hall. He would find the rear entrance. He would wait for his brother's signal. He would not come through that door until he heard it. That left Thaddeus and Zeke in the middle of the street with 2 horses and a mule and a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Thaddeus dismounted. He drew his father's rifle from the saddlebow. He handed the reins of the bay to Zeke. Then he did something that surprised the old man. He walked to Zeke's stirrup, and he reached up and he took the old man's hand in both of his own, and he pressed it to his forehead the way a son presses his father's hand. "You have been our father," he said, "since the day our father could not be." I do not know if I have ever said it. Zeke Pembroke could not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Go on, boy. Go do what has to be done. I am right here behind you, the way I have been all along." Thaddeus Blackwood turned and walked down the middle of the street of Silver Creek alone. He did not hurry. He carried his father's rifle in the crook of his arm and the oilcloth bundle under his elbow, and his boots struck the boards of the crossing and the dust of the street in the same slow rhythm in which his heart was beating. A curtain moved at a window above the dry goods store. A face looked out and then vanished. A dog began to bark somewhere and then went quiet as if someone inside the house had laid a hand across its muzzle. 42 years old, 2 decades of silence. One walked down one street to end them both. He reached the steps of the municipal hall, and he climbed them and he pushed open the door. Inside, the front room was empty except for a long counter and a row of empty chairs and the smell of cigar smoke. A short hallway led to the back. At the end of the hallway was a heavy door standing half open, and through the gap, Thaddeus saw the edge of a desk and the sleeve of a black frock coat and the hem of a navy blue traveling dress. He walked down the hallway. He stopped at the door, and he pushed it open the rest of the way with the muzzle of his father's rifle. The room was Thorne's office. It was larger than it had any right to be. A walnut desk the size of a small boat. A rack of shelves holding ledgers and legal volumes. A tall window at the back closed and curtained. 6 men with pistols and rifles arranged around the walls. Thorne himself seated behind the desk in a high-backed chair. And beside the desk in a wooden chair with her wrists tied in front of her hair loose around her face, her chin lifted, and her eyes clear, Coralie Ashmore. She looked at Thaddeus Blackwood, and she did not cry, and she did not smile. She only breathed out slowly as if she had been holding that breath since the morning she left the cabin. Horatio Thorne leaned back in his chair, and he folded his soft hands on the desk in front of him, and he smiled. "The elder of the Blackwood boys," he said. "I confess I expected all 3 of you. Have your brothers lost their nerve, or are they merely running late?" "They will be along," Thaddeus said. Thorne tilted his head. "And the ledger." Thaddeus set the oilcloth bundle on the corner of the desk. Thorne unwrapped it with something like anticipation in his soft white fingers. He lifted the leather book. He opened it. He turned pages. His smile, which had been thin and careful, began to thin further. By the time he had turned to the final pages, his face had gone the color of old paper. "This is not the original," he said quietly. "No," Thaddeus said. "The original is in the hand of a federal judge by now. This is an exact copy made last night by a 70-year-old man who has been my father's friend for longer than you have been alive." Thorne's hand moved very slowly to the drawer of his desk. Silas Blackwood had been counting the seconds on the roof of the church across the square. He saw through the tall back window of Thorne's office the movement of Thorne's hand. He saw the shape of the pistol Thorne lifted from the drawer. He let out half a breath, and he let the trigger surprise him the way he had taught Coralie to do, and the window shattered inward in a bright white burst of glass, and the pistol jumped out of Horatio Thorne's hand and struck the wall and skidded under a bookshelf. Thorne's men turned toward the window. That was when the back door blew inward off its hinges. Obadiah Blackwood came through it with the broad axe in both hands and the scars of 22 years on his back hidden under a clean flannel shirt, and he did not swing the axe at any man. He swung it at the oil lamp that hung on a chain above the small table at the side of the room. The chain parted, the lamp fell and burst on the floorboards, and the oil ran out in a spreading pool, and the wick caught it, and a sheet of pale flame rose up between Thorne's men and the door. In that same instant, the side door of the office opened, and a thin girl in a mouse-colored dress slipped through it. Prudence Merriweather had been waiting in the kitchen pantry across the corridor since long before sunrise, listening through the wall for the moment she had been promised would come. In her hand, she carried a small paring knife she had taken from the kitchen at first light. She dropped to her knees beside Corley Ashmore's chair, and she sawed through the soft cord that bound Corley's wrists until it parted and fell away. Corley stood up. She did not run to Thaddeus. She turned instead, and she reached out and she took Prudence Merriweather by the shoulders, and she drew that 16-year-old girl behind her own body so that her own body was between Prue and every gun in the room. Then she looked across the rising line of lamp fire at Horatio Thorne, and the look she gave him was the look her father had given dying men on a battlefield. Not hatred, something worse than hatred. Certainty. "Your day is done, Mr. Thorne," she said. Thorne lunged for the pistol that had skidded under the bookshelf. Thaddeus Blackwood shot once from the hip with his father's rifle. The bullet struck the floorboard 2 inches in front of Thorne's reaching hand, and the splinters jumped up, and Thorne jerked back with a cry. And in the same moment, the two Thorne men nearest the front of the room raised their rifles to fire at Thaddeus, and they never got the chance. Silas Blackwood on the church roof fired twice in quick succession through the shattered window, and both men went down clean, one in the shoulder and one in the thigh, not killed but finished for the day, their weapons clattering away across the floor. The remaining four Thorne men looked at the sheet of fire cutting the room in half, and they looked at the big man with the axe standing in the back doorway, and they looked at the shattered window, with a rifle still smoking somewhere on the other side of it, and three of the four of them dropped their weapons and raised their hands, and the fourth tried to make a run for the front door and tripped over his own boots and lay on the floor cursing and did not get up again. It was over in perhaps 11 seconds. It had taken 2 decades to arrive. Thaddeus Blackwood walked across the room around the line of fire, and he holstered his father's rifle under his arm, and he reached Corley Ashmore and Prudence Merriweather, and he did not take Corley into his arms because there were 6 men in the room and a fire on the floor, and the town of Silver Creek outside holding its breath. He only reached out, and he laid his enormous weathered hand against the side of her face for 1/2 of 1 second, and she closed her eyes and pressed her cheek against his palm, and that was all. Then there was the sound of many hooves in the street outside. Judge Fenwick Ainsworth had ridden through the night from Laramie with his 15 marshals, and he had not arrived at noon as planned. He had arrived 1 hour early. He had heard the gunshots from half a mile out, and he had put his heels to his horse. He came through the front door of the municipal hall in a long black coat with a federal badge on his lapel and a pair of silver-rimmed spectacles on the end of his nose. And he took in the scene in one sweep of those cold, intelligent eyes, and he said in a voice that filled the room, "United States Marshals, everybody lower your hands slowly and step away from any weapon within reach." 3 of his marshals moved to put out the fire with their coats. 2 more took Horatio Thorne by the elbows and lifted him bodily out of his chair. The rest spread through the room, collecting pistols and rifles and the broken pieces of the oil lamp. And within another minute, the office of the mayor of Silver Creek had become the scene of the largest federal arrest in the history of Johnson County. Judge Ainsworth walked to Thaddeus and extended his hand. "Your father," the judge said, "would be proud of you today. He would be prouder still if he knew the 4 of you did not kill a single man in the doing of it. Zebediah Blackwood did not raise killers. He raised men who understood the difference." Thaddeus took the judge's hand. Then Judge Ainsworth turned to Corley Ashmore, and his cold face softened in a way that surprised Thaddeus. Miss Ashmore, he said, I served with your father in the 2nd Pennsylvania Field Hospital. He held my hand the night they took a piece of grape shot out of my leg at Chancellorsville. I would not be standing in this room today if not for Thomas Ashmore. I heard your name from the writer Ezekiel Pembroke sent me last night, and I did not sleep the rest of the way here. Justice for the Blackwood family is justice for your father as well, child. He would have wanted you to know that. Corley Ashmore could not speak. She reached out and took the old judge's hand, and she held it to her forehead the way she had seen Thaddeus hold Zeke's hand that morning, and the judge patted her hair, the way a grandfather pats the hair of a small girl, and that was how her father was finally buried in her on a summer morning in 1883 in the office of a dead man's tyranny. The trial was held in Silver Creek 1 week later. They brought in a circuit court from Cheyenne. They brought in witnesses from 9 counties. Judge Ainsworth himself presided because the case was federal. Ezekiel Pembroke took the stand and held the leather ledger in his trembling old hands and read aloud from pages that Zebediah Blackwood had written in 1861, and the courtroom was so silent you could hear the judge's pen scratch on the record. Prudence Merriweather took the stand and told the story of her mother's death and her own imprisonment in the back of the municipal hall, and 3 women in the gallery began to weep and could not stop. A young rancher from 30 miles north rode in and testified that Thorne had forged his signature on a deed of sale 2 years before. An elderly widow whose husband had disappeared in 1880 was carried into the courtroom on a chair by her grandsons and told the jury what she had known in her bones but never been able to prove. By the end of the 2nd day, the jury did not even retire to deliberate. They stayed in their seats, and the foreman rose and said, Your Honor, we are prepared to render a verdict now if it pleases the court. It pleased the court. Horatio Thorne was convicted on 3 counts of murder, 11 counts of fraud, 7 counts of forgery, and 1 count that the judge entered into the record in his own words as a conspiracy to pervert the laws of the territory for the purposes of private gain. He was sentenced to hang. The sentence was carried out in Cheyenne the following month, far from Silver Creek, because Judge Ainsworth did not want the ghost of Zebediah Blackwood to have to stand on the same ground as the ghost of the man who had put him there. And then the judge did something else. He reopened the case of the state versus Zebediah Blackwood, 1861. He admitted the ledger as new evidence. He called Ezekiel Pembroke as witness. He called the 3 sons of the accused. And at the end of that brief reopening, in the same courtroom in Silver Creek, Judge Fenwick Ainsworth issued a posthumous order of vindication entered into the federal record which declared Zebediah Blackwood innocent of the charges for which he had been hanged 22 years before, and ordered the return of the 2,000 acres of Blackwood family land to his 3 sons with additional compensation drawn from the seized assets of Horatio Thorne. The order was signed and sealed and witnessed, and when the judge laid down his pen, the 3 Blackwood brothers and 1 old sheep man from north of town sat in the front row of the gallery in perfect silence, and none of them cried, but all of their faces were wet. 1 month later, on a clear morning in September of 1883, Corley Ashmore stood on the porch of the cabin, high on the shoulder of the Bighorn Mountains, and the 3 Blackwood brothers and Zeke Pembroke stood in a half circle in the yard before her. They had cleaned up. Thaddeus wore a clean white shirt under a dark wool vest. Obadiah had trimmed his beard and his hair was combed. Silas had on a new red bandana that Corley had made for him from a bolt of cloth Zeke had brought up from town. Zeke himself stood a little apart with his Bible in his hands, the way he had always stood a little apart, a father by circumstance and by choice. Thaddeus Blackwood took off his hat and held it in his hands against his chest. Miss Ashmore, he said. Corley. She waited. My brothers and I have talked for 3 nights straight about the thing we are about to say to you, and we decided this morning that I would be the one to say it because I am the oldest, and because the oldest is the one who has to say the hardest things. So I will say it plain. My brothers and I are 42 years old. We have been alone on this mountain for 22 years. We each of us love you in a different way, and all of us love you in the same way, and we understood a long time ago that we could not ask you to choose between us because choosing between us would break the brotherhood. That is the only thing we had to give you in the first place." Obadiah lowered his eyes. Silas did not lower his. Silas looked straight at her the way he had looked at her after her first shot at the tin cans. "So we are not asking you to choose," Thaddeus said. "We are asking you to stay. Not as a bride, not as anything with a name on it. As Coralie Ashmore, who is welcome in this house for every day she wants to be, in it for the rest of her life as family. The cabin is yours as much as it is ours. The land is yours as much as it is ours. Weshams. The name over the door can be changed or not changed as you please. We are asking you to be a Blackwood the way a man is a Blackwood, by blood or by choice or by both. And we are telling you that if you say yes, none of us will ever raise the question of marriage again, unless one day you raise it yourself." Zeke Pembroke stepped forward then, and he laid his weathered hand lightly on top of Corley's head, the way a father lays a hand at a blessing. "Your father," he said softly, "once told me, on a battlefield, that the Lord builds his houses in strange shapes, and a wise man does not quarrel with the architecture. You are home, child. You have been home since the storm." Coralie Ashmore looked at the four men standing in the yard before her. She looked at Thaddeus, whose whole face had aged 10 years while he said what he had said, and whose honey-colored eyes held hers without flinching. She looked at Obadiah, whose scarred hands were twisted together in front of him, the way a boy twists his hands when he is waiting for an answer that might break him. She looked at Silas, who had the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth, as if he already knew what she was going to say, and was only waiting to hear her say it. She looked at Zeke Pembroke, who had served her father on a field of blood, and whose blue eyes were wet again. She said yes, that was all. One word, and the word was enough. 1 year passed. In the spring of 1884, the trail up the Bighorn from Silver Creek was no longer a secret path known only to four men. There was a proper wagon road now graded and graveled, and at the end of it, a tall timber arch with letters burned into the crossbeam. Ashmore Blackwood Ranch. Beneath the name, someone had carved smaller a single line. A house of many rooms. Coralie Ashmore ran a small school in a converted bunkhouse at the lower end of the property, where she taught the children of the families Horatio Thorne had tried to ruin. Prudence Merriweather, who had grown 2 inches and learned to laugh again, was her helper and her almost sister. Thaddeus Blackwood handled the correspondence and the books and the matters that required a careful man with a measured hand. Obadiah had expanded his forge into a full smithy that served every ranch within 40 miles, and his horseshoes were the finest in Johnson County. Silas ran the cattle on the lower pastures and had a crew of 4 hands who had all been sons or brothers of Thorne's victims, men who had come looking for work and stayed looking for family. And Zeke Pembroke read his Bible by the hearth every evening and taught Coralie Latin in the afternoons, because he said her father would have wanted her to know some. On a morning in late May, Coralie rode out alone to the valley below, and she stopped at the small cemetery on the south edge of the Blackwood land. There were 4 stones there now, 2 old and 2 new. The 2 old stones said Zebediah Blackwood and Winifred Blackwood. The 2 new stones were small markers Obadiah had carved himself, one for Adelia Crowhurst and one that simply said, "In memory of the 9 never forgotten." But it was the oldest stone she stopped at. She knelt in the grass before Zebediah Blackwood's grave. Someone had cleaned the stone recently, and she knew without being told that it had been Thaddeus. A fresh bouquet of wild prairie flowers lay at its base, and she knew without being told that those had been Obadiah. A single polished river stone rested on top of the marker, and she knew without being told that Silas had put it there. On the face of the stone beneath the name and the dates, new words had been cut in clean, fresh chisel strokes in the spring of 1884. Vindicated, honored, remembered. Coralie Ashmore took her father's Bible out of her saddlebag, and she laid it open on top of the stone at the 23rd Psalm, and she left it there for a long moment in the morning sun, and then she took it back and closed it and held it against her chest. Behind her at a respectful distance, 4 horses waited quietly. On them sat 3 large men with the same face, and 1 old man with a white beard, because they had followed her down that morning, And they would follow her back up, and they would go on following her for all the days of her life, and she would go on leading them, because that was the shape the Lord had chosen for the house he was building in the shadow of the bighorn. Coralie Ashmore stood up from the grave of the man who had become father to her heart. She turned to face the men who were her home. The sun rose higher over the peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, and in its clean new light, 4 horses and 5 hearts began the slow ride back up the trail toward a cabin where the fire was already lit and the coffee was already on.